Welcome to a discussion with Signe, our research lead at Just Life, and Jessica Field, author of a new report that Just Life is publishing titled Lifelines, A History of Temporary Accommodation in England from 1834 to 2011. If we could start with you quickly, Jess, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and give us a brief overview of the report and some of its main points?
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. As Morgan said, I'm Jessica Field. I'm a social historian and a writer. My background is in humanitarian history and policy, but from 2017, I began looking at issues of housing insecurity, renting and homelessness, partly fueled by my family's own experience of them, the mass eviction of them and their neighbours. So I was involved in that campaign, and then that progressed into academic research. I'm a historian by background. So working with Just Life on this report was a fantastic opportunity for me to get stuck into archives on a subject I'm really passionate about. And in a nutshell, Lifelines charts the history of temporary accommodation from 1834, which was the advent of the Poor Law Amendment Act, the new Poor Law, which systematised the workhouses, the workhouse system, which I can go on to in a bit more detail later, and takes it all the way to 2011. Now, it was a deliberate choice not to bring this up to the present because it was a historical study, and we were keen to maintain some level of distance with the material. 2011 marks a sort of change into the most recent phase we're in of the provision and management of temporary accommodation. And although these dates aren't absolute, the legislation that was passed in 2011 that marks the end point of the report is the Localism Act, which saw councils being given the ability to discharge their homelessness duty to households in the private rental sector without accounting for the preferences of those households. So that marked the current era that we're in, that the report doesn't examine in as much detail. But the purpose of the report was to try and descriptively chart the history of temporary accommodation over that nearly 200-year period. It's 177 years, filling in some gaps that haven't been documented before. There's obviously been a lot of fantastic academic work on the evolution of homelessness law and policy, but this was more of a social history that looks at the conditions of temporary accommodation as they've evolved over that time, how they've been experienced by people as far as the records are able to share. And just to give a brief overview of the structure and the contents of the report. So it's a long read, but it's divided into essentially 6 substantive sections, which can be largely accessed independently. There's a historical chronology. So chapter 2 charts the legal and policy history, if you want that sort of background framework for how temporary accommodation has been governed over the last nearly 200 years. Section 3 is titled The Deservingness Filter, and that looks at the evolution of the ideological and moral framework that has underpinned temporary accommodation over the last 2 centuries. And I'm sure we're going to get into what deservingness means in the context of temporary accommodation very soon. Chapter 4 explores the administration and the management of temporary accommodation through and how it's been fragmented via various different laws, departments, obviously through local authorities, and then different departments within that, delegated down to local officer, local housing officer, authority level. Lots of decisions have been essentially delegated to that ground level, and looks at how, the implications of those layers of fragmentation and delegation, including particularly the impact of administrative decisions like outsourcing to private providers and out of area placements, which I know are 2 very kind of pressing concerns at the moment. Section 5 charts, this is my favourite chapter to research and write actually, and this is titled Mutual Aid and Resistance, and this looks at the campaigns and advocacy and activism of households who've experienced homelessness, who are living in temporary accommodation, their work and their allies fighting against poor treatment, poor conditions, exclusion and injustices. There's a number of case studies of groups who've actually achieved small-scale change in their areas. And then section 6 is termed a moment of progress, and it goes back to the post-war period, that chapter, and looks at the temporary housing programme that emerged after the end of the war, which is one of the only centralised government rollouts of temporary accommodation during this historical period, and actually suggests what gives a little bit of an insight into what good quality temporary accommodation could look like, or elements of it could look like. So it's sort of working towards hope at the end.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's a really, really useful introduction. Thank you. One thing that I was wondering is how you landed on that timeline, because I think even now, as a sector, we sometimes struggle to even define temporary accommodation. There are official statistics that the government uses and that we use to do with the number of households living in accommodation that's been provided to them through a local authority while they look for more, when they've presented it as homeless and they look for a more permanent accommodation. But then there are also things like unsupported temporary accommodation where the conditions are very much the same. It's the same style of housing, but perhaps the person living there hasn't gone directly to a local authority. They've spoken directly with a private landlord and set up some kind of license agreement there, and we also call that temporary accommodation. So I wondered how you sort of landed on that timeline and said this is temporary accommodation from this point onwards. Yeah, if you could speak a little bit about that.
I think that, I mean, that's a really good question, because trying to contain the study was really difficult, precisely because of what you say. There are so many things that have been officially termed temporary, officially been labelled as temporary accommodation, been a type of accommodation that has been used for emergency shelter purposes. But then there's been a whole other range of types of accommodation that people themselves have turned to, as you say, hidden and unsupported temporary accommodation when they found themselves homeless. And the study doesn't pretend to be entirely comprehensive of every type of temporary accommodation a household experiencing homelessness has used over the last 200 years, because that would be really challenging to chart. But it tries to be as inclusive as possible, balancing where the government has legislated around particular types over that time period and other major types of accommodation that households themselves have turned to. So in terms of the ones that government has legislated around, or developed policies around, or allocated to households experiencing homelessness, those include, I mean, in the first instance, the workhouses between 1834 and 1948. Workhouses and similar, they were termed public assistance institutions and in later years. But the equivalent of the workhouse was the main institution an individual or household could turn to if they found themselves destitute and homeless. That was the government provision. After 1948, the terrain fractured a lot, and you'd see things like, so it would be termed temporary accommodation that local councils were in charge of, but they'd be things like halfway houses, so converted houses where rooms had been separated into different living quarters, essentially. There were patched houses or slum clearance houses that had been allocated because they were due to be cleared at some point, but they could still be occupied. Workhouses were turned into reception centres for single people experiencing homelessness, and the government would still use terms like emergency shelter or temporary shelter, or so there were in the course of the study, I had to search quite broadly for the different types of terms that might capture these types of experiences. So I tried to be as inclusive as I can with the kind of government allocated ones, and then there are some that I feature as well that were utilised by households experiencing homelessness that weren't necessarily official. So in the chapter on mutual aid and resistance, I talk a little bit about the squatters movement and households and their advocacy allies occupying squats for lack of other alternatives. And these were essentially unsupported temporary accommodation for many for the longest time, although some were then successfully agreed with the council to be turned into temporary accommodation. So I followed the documentation to a certain extent and looked for stories, looked for accounts using different terminology that might have captured different types and different periods, but it will never be comprehensive because people have to be people have to turn to whatever's around if there isn't official provision there, and that can look like any type of accommodation.
Brilliant, thank you. And Signe, if you wanted to briefly explain your involvement with the report, and also say a little bit about why you think this report is so important for us to understand at Just Life, and also why it may be important for us to understand more broadly as a sector.
Yes, thank you, Jess, for your really helpful overview of the report. So at Just Life, we obviously work with temporary accommodation, and we have frontline workers working directly supporting people in temporary accommodation, and I am part of the research and policy team where we do research, obviously, to try to understand better what the experiences are, but also what the system is, and where we can improve so that the experiences can be improved for people. And also, we're seeing the numbers shooting up recently, the numbers of people experiencing temporary accommodation, but also the amounts that are spent on this provision for local authorities. And local authorities are going bankrupt. So something definitely needs to change. I think it's becoming obvious to everybody that something needs to change from a financial point of view, but obviously from a moral point of view. And so so we see this fragmentation, and we see this escalation, and what we hear and see is that it kind of sits nowhere. Temporary accommodation doesn't sit with housing, it doesn't sit with homelessness, it doesn't sit with welfare. It kind of does a bit. It's like an add-on to welfare, the Home Office, DWP, and then it's administered by local authorities who all do it very differently. So in some places it sits with welfare, in some places it sits with housing. And so we realized that actually it's a really complex picture. And in trying to improve it, that's really difficult when you don't understand the complexity of the whole thing. And so that led us to this project to try to understand better, well, where does it come from? We had an idea that looking back, we would find some similarities historically. So we engaged Jessica because we knew of her work from her book Eviction, which is brilliant. I recommend it. And so where she charts the history of prefabs and eviction, and so we thought, well, if she could do that for temporary accommodation, that would really help not just us but everybody in the sector, give a foundation to understand what are the changes we're seeking, where does it come from. And so she's done that brilliantly. And I have to say, we were expecting to see similarities, but I was surprised to see just how striking it is that in spite of substantial changes to legislation, to funding, there are some things just haven't changed, including things like gatekeeping, because of the fragmentation. It's been unclear who has had the authority to do what, and so it's given very different experiences and different outcomes at different levels and in different geographies and for different groups of people. And I think that's one of the things that come out really, really clearly, that there are always losers in the system. So Jess just mentioned briefly this idea of deservingness, which has really been there throughout, even though who is deserving has changed according to the ideology of the time. But there are always losers in the system, and even though, I mean, it's a basic right, which we really should be proud of in the system, that was established with the Poor Law a long time ago. But how that has been administered and experienced over this long period of time it's fascinating to see, and it's fascinating to see how relevant it is today.
Yeah, great, thank you. I I totally agree, like how important it is to know the history. I mean, I've worked at Just Life for a couple of years now, and before reading this, had thought I'd begun to understand temporary accommodation, and it's not until you look back and do really look at the history that you think actually maybe I didn't really understand where this has come from and why our approach to it is as it is. The
I
next
think
question.
can I come in
Sorry,
there?
go on.
Sorry, Morgan. No,
Of course.
I think one of the the key takeaways from a historical study and why it's so important is because it shows that some of the challenges that Signe outlined that you're facing in the sector today are structural. They are deep-rooted structural problems that will not be undone by just straightforward new money. As important as more money is, more cash and better types of temporary accommodation will not address some of the patterns, historically rooted patterns of exclusion and poor conditions and lack of accountability that we see today. And I think, if there's one takeaway from the report, it's that. And actually turning a blind eye to some of those structural injustices is a political choice at this point. Yes, that's just what I want to add.
And I think that I completely agree. I think that what is so powerfully evidenced in the report is the fragmentation, and without addressing that, we will continue to get poor outcomes. Maybe not for everybody, but for a huge amount of people, because there is no oversight, there is no accountability, and people get lost in the system. And so it's impossible to actually properly ascertain what's going well and what is not going well, and why is that. So without addressing that fragmentation, we will continue to get poor outcomes and expensive outcomes.
Yeah, it's almost like we've created a service of sorts, like we have a health service, but not giving it the due care and attention that we give to some of our other sort of statutory services. And it's not seen like that. It doesn't have a regulator, for example, like a lot of statutory services do. And maybe some of that is because of the deservingness element. So that leads us nicely into the next question. And this is for both of you. The report talks about temporary accommodation being shaped by ideas of deservingness. I think it's referred to as a deservingness ideology. What does that mean, and how does it still show up in the system today? Maybe start with you, Jess.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. So ideas of deservingness will be familiar to anyone that's worked in welfare governance over the longest time. But essentially, it speaks to a moral and ideological framework that helps sort people, for want of a better word, sort those who warrant assistance for their struggles, destitution, homelessness, poverty, those who deserve assistance, from those who don't, from those who should be excluded, or whom only deserve the worst quality condition. So it's a sort of filter. Now, it originated in the it's got a long history. It didn't just originate in the Victorian era, but it was sort of codified in relation to temporary accommodation in the Victorian era through the workhouses. The workhouses as institutions were explicitly sorted people via deservingness, because they wanted to deter people in general from seeking state assistance. It was getting costly, they were finding it hard to manage, and the sort of governing attitude at the time, where there were lots of people who could work and could pay their own way, but they were choosing not to, and so that needed to be stomped down. The best way to prevent that would be to make workhouse conditions worse than anyone could possibly find on the outside. So it was codified as explicit in that era. That doesn't mean it's explicit today, and that doesn't mean that it still doesn't exist. And it's endured today primarily. You can see it in lots of different ways. You can see it's visible in the priority need criteria in the homelessness duty, the sorting of people via certain household characteristics and vulnerability. It's visible in the persistent overrepresentation of certain groups and households in the worst conditions of temporary accommodation, out of area placements, or temporary accommodation more generally. That obviously speaks to overrepresentation and structural injustice in housing in general, but temporary accommodation is a facet of that. And I think it's most explicit in the post-1999 separation of treatment for people seeking asylum from mainstream homelessness, sending them down a different, explicitly deterrent pathway with separately managed asylum accommodation via the Home Office and then contracted out to private partners after 2012. And I think the key kind of takeaway about the deservingness ideology is that it's not about intent. You will rarely, hopefully rarely, of course, a major problem that this report has revealed is that just isn't sufficient data collection at the ground level. But you are unlikely to find housing officers and the like sitting there with cases and going, yes, I feel like your case, you deserve help, and oh no, you're going in the bin, you don't deserve help. It's not as obvious as conscious intent. But its endurance and its pervasiveness is the way it has come to normalize outcomes, normalize poor conditions. We treat them as almost inevitable and purely a cost problem. Normalize the overrepresentation, the persistent overrepresentation of certain groups in certain types of accommodation. The abhorrent conditions that people seeking asylum have to face in asylum accommodation. But equally in lots of types of temporary accommodation managed by local councils. So in the present day, it's more manifest in the way that poor outcomes and poor conditions have been completely naturalized as inevitable.
I would add to that. So we support in our frontline work at Just Life, we support single adults in temporary accommodation, and many of them are maybe not your poster child because they suffer from various mental health conditions, they suffer with substance misuse, they're not pretty. So why should we help them? And this really contrasts with the fact that it's a basic right. It's a basic human right.
And we've structurally trapped ourselves into this system. I mean, this is a kind of a post-war system that we are still operating today, even after some really progressive, important reforms in the latter part of the 20th century. It was determined that single people experiencing homelessness weren't owed the same sort of duty as families with children, households with children, and where they have gained better access to assistance, it has been purely on the basis of proving some kind of vulnerability, like stepping up to a measuring stick that requires some level of either personal culpability, judgments around personal culpability, or judgments around capacity or health and things like that. So we've baked it into the way that we manage the system, and then it's completely normalized as if that is a unproblematic way to keep assessing experiences of homelessness, and it's not neutral, it's not objective.
Yeah, and I suppose a trickier question, but do you think that we can, we will talk about policy more later on, but do you think we can address this idea of, or remove this idea rather, of the deserving and the undeserving through policy intervention, or is it something more deep-seated in our society and something about us where we view people as deserving and undeserving? Is it something that the governments can actually address in the here and now?
I think it's interesting to look at the NHS, isn't it? So post-war, the NHS was established, and I mean that was a policy decision, and everybody has bought into the universal access, that it should be equally accessible to everybody, regardless of their background or their need. But obviously that was a particular time in history where the general population was open to change because of what had preceded this decision.
And there's precedent within the United Kingdom. I think Scotland's abolished priority need criteria. I mean, I'm less comfortable commenting on the current policy terrain, being a historian. However, I think one of the things that your question speaks to is the need for better data to understand the impacts of these what look like mundane administrative processes. And this is one of the key asks from the report, one of the key policy asks, which is to make discriminatory harms visible, essentially. Start collecting data that shows conditions and relates those to equalities data. And then we can start understanding patterns of harms that are experienced by different groups. I think you're right, Morgan, that the deservingness ideology permeates much more than temporary accommodation. It's visible in broad areas of welfare and has been for the longest time. But that's not to say that things can't be changed, attitudes can't be changed, or people can't be held to account for acting on those attitudes, and we do have good precedent for that in this country. And I think the key thing would be starting to systematically evidence what is happening on the ground, and then giving any kind of regulatory framework some kind of teeth in terms of proper enforcement.
And I think that, sorry if I can jump in, I think that there is a lot of political will at the moment. So if I can speak to what's happening at the moment, and you will know this, Morgan, there is an understanding that it's not enough for it to sit with housing and homelessness. We need collaboration between DWP, health, the Home Office, and so there is work ongoing towards addressing the fragmentation. Although as I said earlier, I've been surprised in this report through this work to see just how baked into the system it is. And I think that a piece of work like this is going to be incredibly valuable at the moment, given the actions and the interests currently with the government. Obviously, the government is busy thinking about other things at the moment, so it's very much sort of stop and start. But I think that there is a genuine interest in doing things differently.
Quite a bit about fragmentation so far, and you just touched on it then, Signe. But there's a powerful argument in the report that responsibility for temporary accommodation keeps being displaced between different departments, duties, and systems. Do we think that temporary accommodation has suffered because it's not treated properly as housing policy, and what do we do to change that?
Sorry,
go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, I was just going to say it has suffered from being both, I want to say, deprioritized, which has come as a consequence of being underestimated as a sort of welfare need. Not necessarily consciously deprioritized, but comes a consequence of that assumption that need might be small at certain times, and then fragmented, passed between different governing bodies. And the key turning point for that historically was in the aftermath of World War II. A moment that I found really interesting, because obviously you see the inauguration of the welfare state, the nationalisation of the health service, a mass council house building programme, and post-war reconstruction that was intended to bring near full employment, essentially. So at the time, the government anticipated that need for homelessness support, temporary accommodation, would be really small, and they legislated for it under that basis. What they didn't account for were slow house building programs, delays in actually building houses that people could go in, the increase in evictions that would come with deregulation of the private rent sector in the late 1950s, and other factors that led to to households experiencing homelessness, and it became a problem that has been firefighted by past tense of firefight since then, and so it's been treated on a reactive kind of case overwhelm basis almost since the end of the Second World War. And that has encouraged a sort of buck passing between departments, and temporary accommodation will, like as Signe said not so long ago, it inevitably links into lots of different areas of policy. But in times of kind of resource constraints, ring fence budgets, and competition for attention, departments have passed it between themselves. And in the aftermath of the war, the National Assistance Act that was passed in 1948 that legislated for the provision of temporary accommodation didn't actually state which department should be in charge of it. So local councils pretty much universally determined that it would sit within their welfare department, so treated it as a welfare need rather than a housing need, which obviously then forced lots of people to be assessed on the basis of welfare and social need rather than literally just needing the physical bricks and mortar of a house. Families that had complex problems, or not even families that had complex problems, essentially that's any kind of household might need assistance from different types of areas. It enabled the two departments to pass families between them and deny responsibility, or at least delay, mess people around in order to dissuade, and this is these are the kind of ground level gatekeeping techniques that don't get recorded, so we're never going to truly know the scale of the problem historically and even now. But since that point, the kind of where temporary accommodation has sat has been extremely diffuse, depending on the particular perhaps case itself, or the makeup of the local authority, or the day that the local housing officer might be having, which has meant that it's been it's resulted in poor outcomes for households experiencing homelessness.
And I just want to add to that is it right to give this responsibility to housing officers? So they are given not enough resources and a very, very, very difficult choices. So this is what we hear back from local authorities across the country, that housing officers are not enjoying having to send people away, or having to send them to different departments, or giving them sending them out of area, or sending them into a really substandard, poor condition temporary accommodation. So there's something unjust in the system, not just in terms of the outcomes for people experiencing homelessness, but also for the people who have to work within the system and administer this very vague policies and duties that are unclear.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the report is that it challenges some of the ways in which the TA system operates, and they're sort of basic things that we maybe have just accepted as a reality, and it challenges some of those things. And one of those things that I was thinking about was the kind of the use of private landlords and private contractors and outsourced accommodation. Do we think that private landlords and outsourced accommodation, do we think that's made it harder to see poor conditions, poor decisions, and unequal outcomes for people in TA?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. It's one of the things that was excuse me, quite interesting to me historically was to realize the extent to which outsourcing isn't new. It's frequently been a way to manage temporary accommodation, the physical structures, as well as the services themselves. You can trace that right back to the Victorian era, and then a pattern that has been possible to chart over the course of the timeline of the report is that kind of lack of accountability once a particular area of temporary accommodation has been outsourced. And it's essentially the issue is the one of regulation not chasing the outsourcing procedures. The environment of private landlords or private organisations managing temporary accommodation has been one of self-regulation and self-reporting. Something that Just Life has campaigned on and talked about is the exemption of temporary accommodation from other types of basic standards and conditions that different areas are subject to. You couple that with the provision of temporary accommodation to being provided by private contractors whose business model is organized on this type of income. Where is the incentive to self-report any poor conditions failures, or support failures? And the enforcement isn't just there. So much of even when rules have followed, local authorities lack the resources or the expertise, or perhaps the knowledge to trigger inspections that might be able to hold these landlords accountable. So all of these gaps mean that households in these types of accommodation, they fall through the cracks. And of course, it's an extremely vulnerable position to be in. If you're even aware that you might have rights not to live in a house riddled with damp and mold, it can be, it's a very vulnerable position to be in, where it's the roof over your head, and the person managing your accommodation, or the company managing your accommodation, do you feel able and empowered to report that, and what will be the consequences should that happen? And one of the case studies from the report was from 2001, and that was for accommodation that was housing people seeking asylum, and this was contracted out to a private company called Landmark Limited, who placed asylum seekers in this tower block in Liverpool. And for the longest, conditions were terrible. There was poor heating, ventilation, broken fittings, reported harassment from the landlords. This was all managed and contracted out privately. Occupants complained, health visitors complained, the local MP complained about it, a refugee advocacy organisation based in the area complained about it, and nothing was acted on until I think around a dozen of the residents, people seeking asylum, went on hunger strike to draw attention to their cause, which kickstarted a government investigation, which exposed abysmal conditions within the tower block. And in the end, they terminated their contract with the private provider. So that took, that was a huge cost to the people, huge personal cost to the people that were living in the tower block. And then what happened to them afterwards? They just got got dispersed again to other areas outside of where they'd been built their they'd started building their lives and their networks and settling. Some to decent accommodation, others to who knows where. But there isn't necessarily a positive outcome after reporting. So the accountability trails are lacking, and the burden disproportionately falls on people who live in this accommodation themselves, who are already in a really vulnerable moment in their lives, and that pattern is repeated throughout the timeline.
And if we look at it systemically, so of course people do have redress in law, which is something that we should celebrate and be happy about in this country. That actually people have rights, but in order to obtain those rights, you would have to go and take it to court. And that requires resources of the individuals or the families who want to contest the conditions that they've been placed in. And these are resources that very few people have in this situation. So this individualization means that systemically nothing will change, even if it may change for one family in one local authority area.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So another thing that I wanted to talk about that's mentioned in the report, and actually that the story that you just gave about asylum seekers in Liverpool is very relevant to this question. The report shows that out-of-area placements and dispersal have disproportionately affected migrant and racialized communities for decades. Why does that history matter for how we understand the system now?
It matters because it shows that that overrepresentation in poor quality conditions, and worse outcomes, that the fact that there's an evidenceable pattern shows it's a structural problem. It's not, just a geographically bounded, temporally bounded, just happening over here in that location at this time, because it is something that is embedded within the way that we manage temporary accommodation, or just repeatedly manifests because we're not mitigating against it. And I think you can chart that. It's taken different forms in different eras depending on the racialized ideologies of the time. You saw in the post-war period with the increase in migration from Commonwealth countries. You saw the implementation of dispersal policies. These minoritized migrant communities and individuals would obviously be seeking work and accommodation in particular areas, be fully entitled as British subjects to access the welfare system as British citizens, but they would be subject to undue suspicion for their reasons for seeking any form of assistance. That it would be assumed, it was assumed that they were disproportionately accessing welfare assistance and things like rent assistance or help with accommodation in ways that they weren't triggering certain investigations. And though there was a trial of actual dispersal mirroring the policies faced by people seeking asylum today. In the immediate post-war era, local authorities were keen to move Commonwealth migrants around to different areas to maintain a sort of imagined ideal racial balance in communities. The idea that you wouldn't want to send too many Commonwealth migrants to an area in case it made the white British citizens feel uncomfortable or whatever. This was an active policy that was employed in the aftermath of, or just in the post-war period. So you see echoes of the same thing today. Dispersal isn't a new way of managing migrant and racialized communities, and this shows that it's structural and needs to be addressed in ways that we haven't already.
And it looks individualized, doesn't it? So that's your problem, this family's problem, when actually it's not. It's an outcome of a system that is dysfunctional.
Yeah, and it's less evidence, but I think there's a lot of that discrimination. A lot of that discrimination exists today. I think in the disproportionate numbers of people from minority ethnic backgrounds being placed out of area. And this is more anecdotal than evidence, but I think that a lot of the time people who have come through the asylum system and are now being placed in temporary accommodation, if they are coming through that system, they're deemed to not have that sufficient connection to the area and are more likely then to be placed further afield and much further afield as well. Because again, even though they might have been in the area in asylum accommodation for years and they have community, friends, family there, support services, they're viewed maybe by housing teams as not having that sufficient connection. And if we're going to place people out of area, they're the people to go. So
and what
I
we
think
often hear, sorry, if I can, I'm just thinking that what we hear, because we obviously work directly with people who are placed in temporary accommodation, but we also work with local authorities and the people who are charged with administering this system, and we work with national government. But what we often hear, what I have heard back is that, well, they tend to be larger families. And so in order to give them sufficient space, we have to go to cheaper areas, basically. And so that feels like a sensible decision. But it's the outcome of systemic choices. And so if you roll back and don't put it on the housing officer, but actually on national government and making decisions around what housing is needed where in the country, then that shifts responsibilities and would create different outcomes for people. But we don't know these things. We hear this anecdotally all the time at Just Life. Of course, there is some research, but there's a limit to how much we can provide as charities. So we really need data collection and oversight within the system.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for that. So I think before we look to the future and what needs to happen to address some of the issues outlined in the report, it would be good to mention the prefabs, because it's used in the report as an example of, or the only example of, decent quality temporary accommodation, these prefabricated houses that were built after the war, for returning soldiers. They're not spoken about entirely glowingly. There was many issues there, but they were at least a decent attempt to build something for people that met their needs a bit more than what we do now. So could we talk a little bit about the prefabs and what we can learn from that period of history?
So the prefab housing program was a temporary and explicitly temporary housing program that developed just towards the end of the war. So 1944, just before the end of the war, and it had cross-party consensus, a lot of support by the coalition government, and what it entailed was the construction of over 156,000 temporary prefabricated bungalows that were made using new methods, innovative methods of temporary construction that were manufactured in factories and then could be put up on site with the minimum amount of labour. Now, it's a really important moment in the history of temporary accommodation and isn't one that often gets talked about in histories of housing or homelessness. I think because it was a discrete programme that only built 156,000 and wasn't replicated afterwards. But it was essentially a central government decision to construct and invest in decent quality temporary houses for people to live in after the war, people who were either homeless after returning from the war, or who were in abysmal conditions, slum housing effectively. The allocation choices were still held at the local authority level, but what was distinctive about this program was that these bungalows were self-contained, so it was one family, one household per construction. Something that's been persistently valued by households experiencing temporary accommodation over the course of the timeline. Came with small front gardens. They were personalizable, even though they were only temporary, and many were constructed with the idea of creating a community, even though the buildings themselves were only to have 10 to 15-year lifespans. Now, the short lifespan of the construction is problematic because of the environmental implications of waste and disposal. But that aside, its significance in the history of temporary accommodation and housing is that it evidences what can happen if there is political will and investment to provide decent quality temporary accommodation. Now these were reserved primarily, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, for a more deserving homeless population that was primarily returning ex-servicemen and their families. Single people were not entitled to live in them. And local authorities drew up essentially a points-based list that would assist with allocation. So as I say, they were not perfect, but they're really striking in the history of temporary accommodation because they show what can be achieved in terms of quality, if there is political will and funding behind them. Now, part of the problem with that programme was that there wasn't sufficient move on housing built, and so a lot of these prefabricated structures were only built to last 10 to 15 years and ended up staying put for decades. But I think their quality and the praise that they got from the occupants who lived inside them, I think, speak volumes about what could be possible. Decision to construct and invest in decent quality temporary houses for people to live in after the war, people who were either homeless after returning from the war, or who were in abysmal conditions, slum housing effectively. The allocation choices were still held at the local authority level, but what was distinctive about this program was that these bungalows were self-contained, so it was one family, one household per construction. Consistently valued by households experiencing temporary accommodation over the course of the timeline. came with small front gardens. They were personalizable, even though they were only temporary. And many were constructed with the idea of creating a community, even though the buildings themselves were only to have 10 to 15-year lifespans. Now, the short lifespan of the construction is problematic because of the environmental implications of waste and disposal. But that aside, its significance in the history of temporary accommodation and housing is that it evidences what can happen if there is political will and investment to provide decent quality temporary accommodation. Now these were reserved primarily, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, for a more deserving homeless population that was primarily returning ex-servicemen and their families. Single people were not entitled to live in them. And local authorities drew up essentially a points-based list that would assist with allocation. So as I say, they were not perfect, but they're really striking in the history of temporary accommodation because they show what can be achieved in terms of quality if there is political will and funding behind them. Now, part of the problem with that programme was that there wasn't sufficient move on housing built, and so a lot of these prefabricated structures were only built to last 10 to 15 years and ended up staying put for decades. But I think their quality and the praise that they got from the occupants who lived inside them, I think, speak volumes about what could be possible.
And it shows what's possible with political will.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot. So the big and final question, I suppose, is what would a genuinely humane temporary accommodation system look like? Can we learn that from the history? What not to do? What to do? What would a genuinely humane temporary accommodation system look like?
What we need is we need to learn from the fragmentation and how impossible and unmanageable the system has become over decades of add-ons and ad hoc solutions. And so we really need a coherent legislative framework for temporary accommodation that has its own specific, area of policy and not an add-on to various departments that don't speak to each other. I think that is a very clear learning from the work that Jessica's done.
I want to answer that question, I suppose, by speaking more to principles that I got from some of the historical case studies that I was looking at. And I mentioned in the overview that chapter 5 charts a number of case studies of resistance against poor conditions and exclusionary treatment by households in temporary accommodation themselves. And across these case studies, which span decades, the best part of the later 20th century to the early part of the 21st century, there were patterns in what these households and their allies and advocates were essentially requesting basic principles that should help govern and shape temporary accommodation. And they were that temporary accommodation should be characterized by quality, and that includes privacy, so the right to be able to close and lock a door of a room, or ideally a self-contained property, safety within temporary accommodation, and decent furnishings, and a decent setup. So that's number one, quality temporary accommodation. Number two was some kind of community connection, so being able to either sustain the connection within the community they already live, or the ability to develop meaningful community connections elsewhere, depending on the reason, if there are valid reasons to be placed in a different area. The third pattern was the pattern of what these households were calling for in their campaigns, was respect in treatment. So having their needs met, of course, is a very kind of basic and biological minimum, but having their preferences heard and respected, and being welcomed and treated humanely within the system. The fourth was visibility in housing discourse and policy. That didn't necessarily have to be on an individual case-by-case basis, but the data that speaks to their experiences, that being visible and acted upon. And then the fifth was institutional accountability. an accountability that goes beyond perhaps just a single provider of a single piece of temporary accommodation, but an accountability where that sits at the state level, and that being meaningful and enforceable. So those were five patterns of asks essentially that came from homeless households themselves, that I think any decision maker in temporary accommodation should be mindful of when shaping policy moving forward.
And we see those asks today. The research that we do and the people that we work with, it's very much the same. Being able to lock the door, feeling safe, being able to let the children play, not having to feel vulnerable, feel unsafe. It's very much the same that we see today, which is what's so powerful about this report. I also feel that there's a problem with calling it temporary accommodation almost, because it's not really temporary. But as long as we see it as temporary accommodation, it's like it's not the real deal. It's not the real thing that can sit while we're waiting for something else to happen. But actually, it is. People stay there for years, and that really warrants proper conditions, safety, really all the basic things that Jessica just spoke about.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So a lot needs to change, but I think having this context through the history is really important for us that try and address current problems with temporary accommodation. So thanks very much for joining us, Jess and Signe, and thanks everyone for listening. I imagine that we'll be posting this after the report has been published, so do go out and read it. It's titled Lifelines: A History of Temporary Accommodation in England from 1834 to 2011. But if not, if we're posting this early, it's publishing on the 9th of June, I believe. So do go out and read it. Thanks, everyone.